Montana Territory, 1874. The shadows of the pine trees stretched long and thin across the rugged landscape as the sun began its descent behind the jagged peaks of the Bitterroot Mountains. Caleb Morgan sat motionless atop his dun-colored gelding, scanning the horizon with eyes the color of weathered denim. At 25, he had already lived more lifetimes than most men twice his age, orphaned at 12, riding with cattle drives at 15, and now managing his own modest ranch at the edge of the frontier. The wind whipped through the tall grass of the valley, carrying with it the promise of an early winter. Caleb pulled his coat tighter around his broad shoulders, his handsome face set in the same expression he wore most days. A careful mask of stoic determination. His light brown hair curled slightly at the edges of his hat, and a week's worth of stubble shadowed his strong jawline. "No point in waiting around," he muttered to his horse. "Let's head back before dark." As he turned his mount toward home, Caleb reflected on the 5 years since he'd purchased his land. 5 years of backbreaking work, of building fences and a modest two-room cabin, of slowly increasing his herd of cattle from 10 to nearly 100. 5 years of isolation broken only by monthly trips into Willow Creek for supplies and the occasional cattle drive with neighboring ranchers. Caleb had constructed his life with deliberate precision. The frontier demanded nothing less than complete dedication, and he had seen firsthand how entanglements of the heart could destroy everything a man worked for. His own parents had died when their wagon broke an axle crossing a river, his father drowning while trying to save his mother. Love was a luxury the West did not permit, a distraction that could prove fatal in a land that forgave no mistakes. "A man alone answers to no one," he reminded himself, repeating the mantra that had guided him since boyhood. "A man alone survives." The cabin came into view as Caleb crested the final hill. Smoke curled from the stone chimney, and the last rays of sunlight caught on the glass of the windows he'd installed himself last spring. It wasn't much, but it was his 40 acres of good grazing land, a sturdy cabin, a small barn, and enough cattle to turn a modest profit. He dismounted in front of the barn, removed the saddle, and brushed down his horse before leading him into the stall. The evening chores were completed with the same quiet efficiency that characterized all of Caleb's movements. He pumped water from the well, split another armload of firewood, and checked that the chicken coop was secure against predators. Inside the cabin, he lit a lamp and stoked the fire before preparing a simple supper of beans, salt pork, and coffee. As he ate alone at the rough-hewn table, Caleb's eyes drifted to the empty chair across from him. For a brief moment, he allowed himself to wonder what it might be like to have someone sitting there, sharing the day's stories, or simply offering companionable silence. He pushed the thought away as quickly as it had come. Such imaginings were dangerous. Men who dreamed of soft things grew soft themselves, and soft men didn't last long in Montana Territory. Better to embrace the solitude, to find satisfaction in the honest work of his hands and the steady growth of his small ranch. Still, as he washed his dishes and prepared for bed, Caleb could not entirely ignore the hollow feeling in his chest. The cabin seemed to amplify the silence rather than contain it, and the wind whispered through the cracks with a lonesome sound that matched his mood. "This is enough," he told himself firmly as he extinguished the lamp. "This has to be enough." The blizzard struck 3 weeks later with a fury that took even the most weather-hardened settlers by surprise. November had barely begun when the sky darkened to an ominous gray, and within hours, the world disappeared behind a swirling curtain of white. Caleb had spent the morning securing his livestock and reinforcing the barn doors, grateful that he'd laid in extra supplies during his last trip to town. For 2 days, the storm raged without pause. Snow piled against the north side of the cabin until it reached the windowsill, and the temperature dropped so low that ice formed on the inside of the glass. Caleb maintained the fire day and night, venturing out only to check on the animals and to bring in more firewood from the covered stack beside the door. On the 3rd day, the wind finally began to ease, though the snow continued to fall in thick, lazy flakes. Caleb pulled on his heaviest coat and wrapped a woolen scarf around his neck before stepping outside to assess the damage. The world had been transformed into an endless expanse of white, with drifts piled 6 feet high in places. He was clearing a path to the barn when he heard it, a faint sound carried on the wind, so distant that at first he thought he had imagined it. He paused, leaning on his shovel and straining to listen. There it came again, the unmistakable ring of a bell, the kind travelers sometimes attach to their wagons to signal their position in poor visibility. "Damn fools," Caleb muttered, squinting into the distance. Who in their right mind would be out in this? He knew he should ignore it. Whoever was foolish enough to travel in such weather had made their own poor choice. And yet, he found himself trudging through the deep snow toward the Sound, following the road that wound past his property toward Willow Creek. He had gone perhaps half a mile when he spotted it, a wagon partially buried in snow, listing dangerously to one side where a wheel had broken. A single horse stood in the traces, head hanging low, its dark coat crusted with ice. "Hello," Caleb called, approaching cautiously. "Anyone there?" The canvas covering of the wagon rustled, and a face appeared, an elderly woman with silver hair and deep lines etched around her eyes. "Oh, thank the Lord," she said, her voice trembling with cold and relief. "We thought we might perish out here." "We?" Caleb asked, moving closer. The woman nodded. "My granddaughter and I were bound for Helena, where my son has settled. The wheel broke yesterday, and we've been stranded since." As if on cue, a second face appeared beside the old woman's, younger, with features that made Caleb's breath catch despite himself. Large, expressive eyes of deep green surveyed him warily from beneath a wool scarf wrapped around her head. What he could see of her face was pale with cold, but still showed the unmistakable bloom of youth and beauty. "Can you help us, sir?" the young woman asked, her voice surprisingly steady despite their predicament. Caleb hesitated, acutely aware of the complications these strangers would bring to his carefully ordered existence. He had food enough for himself but not much to spare. His cabin was small, with just the one bedroom he used and the main room with the hearth. And worse yet, he had deliberately avoided female company for years, knowing the distractions and the potential for attachment it might bring. But the temperature was dropping again, and the old woman was clearly suffering from the cold. Even from where he stood, Caleb could see the bluish tint to her lips and the way her hands shook as she clutched at the wagon cover. "My ranch is about half a mile back," he said finally. "I can't fix your wheel in this weather, and the road to town is impassable. You'd best come with me until the storm passes." Relief flooded the young woman's face, and she turned to help her grandmother gather their belongings. Caleb unhitched the exhausted horse and loaded the most essential of their possessions onto its back before offering his arm to the old woman. "I'm Caleb Morgan," he said as they began the slow journey back to his cabin. "Flora Foster," the old woman replied, leaning heavily on his arm, "and this is my granddaughter Fiona." Fiona Foster nodded politely, her green eyes meeting his for just a moment before she looked away. She couldn't be more than 22, Caleb guessed, noting the graceful way she moved even through the deep snow and the quiet dignity with which she carried herself. Her hair, where it escaped from beneath her scarf, was a rich chestnut brown that caught the weak sunlight filtering through the clouds. By the time they reached the cabin, Flora was barely able to walk. Caleb helped her inside and settled her in the chair closest to the fire while Fiona hurried to remove her grandmother's wet boots and socks. "I'll see to your horse," Caleb said, uncomfortable with the sudden domestic scene in his previously empty home. "Make yourselves warm." In the barn, as he rubbed down the Foster's horse and provided it with feed and water, Caleb tried to rationalize the situation. It was a matter of basic decency, nothing more. Once the weather cleared, he would help repair their wagon and send them on their way. A few days of inconvenience, and then his life would return to its proper solitary rhythm. When he returned to the cabin, Caleb found Fiona at his stove, stirring a pot that filled the small space with an enticing aroma. She had removed her outer garments to reveal a simple blue dress, worn at the edges but clean and well-mended. Her chestnut hair fell in waves past her shoulders, and her cheeks had regained some color in the warmth of the fire. "I hope you don't mind," she said, glancing up as he stamped the snow from his boots. "We had some dried vegetables and a bit of salt pork in our supplies. I thought I might contribute to our keep by preparing supper." "That's fine," Caleb replied, hanging his coat on a peg by the door. He looked over at Flora, who had fallen asleep in the chair, a quilt drawn up to her chin. "How is she?" Fiona's expression softened with concern. "The cold has aggravated her rheumatism, but she'll recover with rest and warmth." She hesitated, then added quietly, "Thank you, Mr. Morgan, if you hadn't found us when you did." "Caleb," he corrected her automatically, "and there's no need for thanks. Anyone would have done the same." A small smile played at the corners of her mouth. "Not anyone. We passed 3 homesteads before our wheel broke, and not one answered our calls for help." Caleb didn't know how to respond to that, so he busied himself with adding wood to the fire. The cabin felt different with these women in it, warmer somehow, and not just from the heat of the stove. It unsettled him, this sudden change to the space he had carefully maintained as his own private sanctuary. The stew will be ready soon, Fiona said, breaking the awkward silence. Where shall we sleep tonight? I don't wish to displace you from your bed. You and your grandmother can take the bedroom, Caleb replied. I'll make do out here by the fire. She looked as though she might protest, but instead nodded gratefully. Just for tonight. Tomorrow I'll make proper arrangements so we're less of a burden. You're not a burden, Caleb said, surprising himself with the sincerity in his voice. It's a Christian duty to help travelers in need. Supper was a quiet affair, with Flora still too weary for much conversation, and Caleb unaccustomed to mealtime chat. But the stew was delicious, far better than anything Caleb had prepared for himself in years, and he found himself stealing glances at Fiona as she tended to her grandmother with gentle efficiency. That night, as he lay on a bedroll near the hearth listening to the wind howl outside, Caleb tried to ignore the unfamiliar feelings stirring within him. Compassion was one thing, but the way his pulse had quickened when Fiona's fingers accidentally brushed his as she passed him a bowl of stew, that was dangerous territory. Just until the storm passes, he reminded himself, pulling the blanket up to his chin. Just until the storm passes. But as the days turned into a week and the week stretched toward two, the blizzard showed no signs of abating. The snow continued to fall, sometimes gently and sometimes with renewed fury, until the drifts against the cabin reached the eaves. The temperature remained bitterly cold, making repair of the wagon wheel impossible. During that time, an uneasy routine developed. Caleb rose before dawn each day to tend to the livestock, then spent hours clearing paths between the cabin, barn, and well. Fiona took charge of the cooking and indoor chores, while Flora, gradually regaining her strength, occupied herself with mending clothes and telling stories of her youth in Kentucky before the war. Against his better judgment, Caleb found himself drawn into their orbit. At first, he maintained his distance, speaking only when necessary and retreating to the barn to work on projects whenever the cabin began to feel too crowded. But there was something about the way Fiona hummed softly while kneading bread, or the genuine interest in Flora's eyes when she asked about his cattle, that slowly began to erode his carefully constructed walls. One evening, as they sat around the fire after supper, Flora set aside her mending with a sigh. I do believe I've fixed every tear in our clothing twice over, she said with a soft laugh. Perhaps tomorrow you might have a project for these old hands, Mr. Morgan. I'm quite skilled with needle and thread. Caleb, he corrected her for what must have been the 10th time, and I suppose my shirts could use some attention. Never was much good at sewing myself. Flora smiled, the firelight softening the lines of her face. Then it settled. I shall earn my keep by restoring your wardrobe. She yawned delicately behind her hand. But now I think I shall retire. These old bones need more rest than they once did. After helping her grandmother to bed, Fiona returned to the main room and began to clear away the supper dishes. Caleb watched her from his chair, noting the graceful efficiency of her movements and the way the lamplight caught in her hair, turning it to burnished gold in places. You don't have to do that, he said as she filled a pot with water to heat for washing. You've already done more than your share today. Fiona glanced over her shoulder, a small smile playing at her lips. I enjoy keeping busy. Besides, you've given us shelter and shared your supplies. It seems only fair that I contribute what I can. Caleb rose and moved to stand beside her at the stove, uncomfortably aware of her proximity. May I ask you something, Miss Foster? Fiona, she corrected him, mimicking his own frequent reminder. And yes, of course. What takes you and your grandmother to Helena? It's a difficult journey even in good weather, let alone winter. A shadow crossed Fiona's face, and for a moment, Caleb thought she might not answer. Then she sighed and turned to face him fully. My father died at Shiloh, she said quietly. Mother tried to keep our farm going, but it was too much for her alone. She passed 3 years ago. My uncle, my mother's brother, took me in, but his wife, she trailed off, then straightened her shoulders. Let's just say I was not welcome there. When we received word that grandmother's son, my father's brother, had established himself in Helena and wished for her to join him, it seemed the perfect solution for us both. I'm sorry, Caleb said, feeling the inadequacy of the words. About your parents. Thank you, Fiona turned back to her dishes, but not before Caleb caught the glimmer of tears in her eyes. What of your family? Do they live nearby? I have none, he replied simply. My parents died when I was 12. I worked on various ranches until I saved enough to buy this place 5 years ago. Fiona's hands stilled in the soapy water. So you've been alone all this time. There was something in her tone, not pity which he would have resented, but a genuine compassion that made Caleb uncomfortable in a different way. "I prefer it," he said, more sharply than he'd intended. "The frontier is no place for attachments. They only lead to pain when the land or the elements inevitably take them away." He expected her to be offended by his brusque response, but instead, Fiona regarded him thoughtfully. "Perhaps," she said finally, "or perhaps the harshness of the frontier is precisely why connections matter more, not less. What meaning does survival have if there's no one to share it with?" The question lingered in the air between them, unanswered. Caleb muttered something about checking on the animals and fled to the barn, where the familiar smells of hay and livestock could ground him again. But Fiona's words followed him there, echoing in his mind as he completed chores that had already been done earlier that day. What meaning does survival have if there's no one to share it with? The question haunted him in the days that followed, especially as he observed the easy affection between Fiona and her grandmother. Despite their uncertain future and the hardships they had faced, there was a warmth and joy in their interactions that made his solitary existence seem suddenly barren by comparison. As November gave way to December, the weather finally began to improve. The snow stopped falling, though deep drifts still covered much of the landscape. On a particularly clear morning, Caleb announced that he would attempt to repair the Foster's wagon wheel. "That's wonderful news," Flora said, though Caleb couldn't help noticing that her enthusiasm seemed somewhat forced. "Isn't it, Fiona dear?" Fiona looked up from the bread dough she was kneading, her expression unreadable. "Yes, of course. You've been more than generous with your hospitality, Caleb. We shouldn't impose on you any longer than necessary." "It's no imposition," he heard himself say, surprising both women and himself. "That is, there's no rush. The trails to Helena will be difficult for weeks yet." A small smile touched Fiona's lips. "Nevertheless, we should be prepared to continue our journey when conditions allow." Caleb spent the day retrieving the broken wheel from the abandoned wagon and transporting it back to his barn. The damage was substantial, 2 spokes shattered and the iron rim bent, but not beyond repair for a man with his skills. As he worked, measuring and cutting replacement spokes from seasoned oak he had been saving for fence posts, Caleb found himself working more slowly than usual, taking extra care with each cut and joint. The truth, which he was reluctant to admit even to himself, was that he was in no hurry to see the Fosters leave. Their presence had transformed his cabin from a mere shelter into something that, for the first time since his parents' death, felt like a home. Fiona brought him lunch in the barn, a thick sandwich of cold venison and a jar of hot coffee. "How goes the repair?" she asked, perching on a hay bale as he ate. "It'll take a few days," Caleb replied, deliberately vague. "The wood needs time to set properly after I shape the new spokes." Fiona nodded, pulling her shawl tighter around her shoulders. At 22, she possessed a maturity beyond her years, tempered by the losses she had endured but not hardened by them. In the month since her arrival, Caleb had discovered that beneath her quiet demeanor lay a quick wit and a surprising streak of stubbornness. "Grandmother and I were talking," she said after a comfortable silence. "We'd like to prepare a special meal for Christmas. It's only a week away, and we thought it might be a way to thank you for all you've done." Christmas, Caleb had almost forgotten the holiday. He hadn't celebrated it since his parents' death, seeing little point in marking the occasion alone. "That's not necessary," he began, but Fiona shook her head firmly. "Please, Caleb, it would mean a great deal to us." Looking into her earnest green eyes, Caleb found he couldn't refuse. "All right," he conceded. "But only if you'll allow me to contribute something to the occasion as well." Fiona's smile brightened her entire face. "I was hoping you might say that. Grandmother has been fretting about the lack of a proper tree." "Do you think you could find one?" "I reckon I could manage that," Caleb replied, surprised by his own eagerness to please her. "There are some nice pines on the North Ridge." The week before Christmas passed in a flurry of secret preparations. Caleb procured not only a perfect 7-foot pine, but also managed to shoot a young buck on one of his excursions, providing meat for the holiday feast. Meanwhile, Flora and Fiona transformed the cabin with small touches: pine boughs over the mantel, candles saved from their travel supplies, and a string of red berries gathered from the winter-hardy shrubs near the creek. On Christmas Eve, as Caleb returned from his evening chores, he paused at his own threshold, struck by the scene within. The cabin glowed with warmth and light. The tree stood in the corner, adorned with simple ornaments fashioned from pine cones, scraps of colored fabric, and even a few precious glass baubles that Flora had carried all the way from Kentucky. The scent of roasting venison and baking bread filled the air, and Fiona and Flora moved around the small space with the comfortable synchronicity of people accustomed to working together. For a moment, Caleb allowed himself to imagine that this was truly his home, not just his house, that the women inside were his family, waiting for his return each day. The longing that accompanied this thought was so acute it was almost painful. Fiona looked up and saw him standing in the doorway. "Come in before you freeze," she called, her cheeks flushed from the heat of the stove. "Grandmother says the weather has made her bones predict snow by morning." "My bones have never been wrong about such things," Flora confirmed from her chair by the fire, where she was stringing more berries. "We'll have a white Christmas, mark my words." Caleb stamped the snow from his boots and hung his coat by the door. "Something smells wonderful," he said, moving closer to the stove where Fiona was basting the venison roast. "Just wait until tomorrow," she replied with a conspiratorial smile. "I've been saving dried apples and currants for a special pudding." That night after Flora had retired, Caleb and Fiona sat by the fire, watching the play of flames against the darkened windows. Outside, snow had begun to fall again, just as Flora had predicted, large flakes drifting lazily past the glass. "I have something for you," Caleb said suddenly, reaching into his pocket. "For Christmas?" Fiona's eyes widened in surprise as he handed her a small package wrapped in a scrap of clean fabric. "Caleb, you shouldn't have. We agreed to keep things simple." "It is simple," he assured her. "Open it." With careful fingers, Fiona unwrapped the gift to reveal a delicate wooden carving of a horse, small enough to fit in the palm of her hand, but detailed enough to show the flowing mane and alert expression. "Oh," she breathed, turning it over to admire the craftsmanship. "It's beautiful. Did you make this?" Caleb nodded, suddenly self-conscious. "I've always whittled to pass the time in winter evenings. Never made anything for anyone else before, though." "Then I'm honored to be the first recipient," Fiona said softly. She reached out impulsively and squeezed his hand. "Thank you, Caleb. I'll treasure it always." The warmth of her touch lingered long after she had withdrawn her hand, and Caleb found himself struggling to maintain his customary reserve. There was something about Fiona Foster that bypassed all his carefully constructed defenses, reaching parts of him he had thought long buried. "I have something for you as well," Fiona said, rising to retrieve a package from beside the tree. "Though it seems quite humble in comparison." Caleb unwrapped the gift to find a woolen scarf, clearly hand-knit from yarn that had been carefully unraveled from some larger garment and redyed a deep forest green. "Grandmother helped with the dyeing," Fiona explained as he ran his fingers over the soft wool. "We used pine needles and some minerals from the creek. I noticed your old one was rather worn." "This is," Caleb paused, searching for words to express the strange tightness in his chest. "No one has given me a gift since I was a boy, thank you." Fiona's smile in response was like the sun breaking through clouds. "Merry Christmas, Caleb Morgan." "Merry Christmas, Fiona Foster." Christmas Day dawned bright and clear, the fresh snow transforming the landscape into a glistening wonderland. After a simple breakfast, Caleb excused himself to tend to the animals, wrapping his new scarf around his neck against the bitter cold. As he worked, he found himself humming Christmas carols he hadn't thought of in years, songs his mother had taught him long ago. The holiday meal was served in mid-afternoon, and Caleb couldn't remember ever seeing his table so laden with food. Besides the venison roast, Fiona had prepared potatoes, carrots, and turnips from the root cellar, cornbread from their dwindling supply of meal, and the promised Christmas pudding, which she ceremoniously doused with a precious spoonful of brandy from a tiny flask Flora produced from her traveling trunk. "A toast," Flora declared, raising her cup of cider. "To Caleb Morgan, whose generosity saved our lives and whose hospitality has made this the warmest Christmas I can remember." "To Caleb," Fiona echoed, her eyes meeting his across the table with a warmth that made his heart race. "And to good company," Caleb added, surprising himself with the sincerity of the sentiment. "I never thought I'd say this, but you've made this place feel like a proper home." The meal passed in comfortable conversation, with Flora regaling them with tales of Christmases past and Fiona occasionally joining in with her own memories. As they ate the Christmas pudding, Caleb realized he was happier than he had been in years, perhaps happier than he had ever been as an adult. The thought was as frightening as it was exhilarating. He had spent so long convincing himself that happiness was too dangerous to pursue, that connections only led to devastating loss. Yet here he sat, in a cabin transformed by warmth and companionship, feeling more alive than he had in memory. Later, as they sat by the fire with cups of coffee laced with the last of Flora's brandy, the old woman sighed contentedly. "What a blessing to have found shelter with such a kind man," she said, patting Caleb's hand. "When our wheel broke, I feared the worst. Instead, we've had the great fortune to enjoy your hospitality." "It's been no hardship," Caleb assured her, acutely aware of Fiona's gaze on him. "In fact, he hesitated, then forced himself to continue. "I've enjoyed having you both here." "Careful, young man," Flora said with a twinkle in her eye. Words like that might make a couple of homeless women reluctant to move on when spring comes. Caleb's heart gave a peculiar lurch at the mention of their eventual departure. "There's no rush," he said carefully. "The wheel isn't fully repaired yet, and the trails won't be passable until at least April." "Nevertheless," Flora replied, setting down her empty cup, "we mustn't presume upon your kindness indefinitely. My son is expecting us, after all." That night, lying on his bedroll by the fire, Caleb stared at the ceiling, turning over Flora's words in his mind. April was still months away, but suddenly it seemed all too close. The thought of the cabin returning to its former silence, of meals alone and evenings with no one to share his thoughts, felt unbearable in a way he couldn't have imagined before the Fosters arrived. What meaning does survival have if there's no one to share it with? Fiona's question from weeks earlier returned to him with new force. He had been surviving, yes, building his ranch and increasing his herd each year, but to what end? What joy would there be in prosperity if experienced in isolation? What comfort would his achievements provide in his old age if there was no one to share them with? These dangerous thoughts accompanied him into sleep, where they transformed into dreams of a future he had never allowed himself to imagine, a future in which Fiona's smile greeted him each evening, and the sound of children's laughter filled the rooms he would add to the cabin come spring. January brought alternating periods of bitter cold and relative thaw. During one of the warmer spells, Caleb rode into Willow Creek for supplies, returning with not only the necessities but also small luxuries: sugar, coffee, a bolt of blue fabric that reminded him of Fiona's eyes, and a newspaper only 2 weeks old. The newspaper became the center of their evening routine. After supper, Caleb would read aloud from its pages while Fiona and Flora worked on various sewing projects. The news from the outside world, of President Grant's administration, of railroad expansion, of developments in the eastern states, seemed to come from another reality entirely, one far removed from their snug cabin and the rhythm of days marked by chores and meals shared in companionable conversation. One evening in late January, as Caleb finished reading an article about homesteading opportunities in the Dakota Territory, Flora set aside her mending with a thoughtful expression. "It makes me wonder what might have become of us if we had not been fortunate enough to find shelter here," she said. "So many women on their own have few options in the West." "You would have managed," Caleb replied, folding the newspaper carefully. "You're both resourceful." Flora shook her head. "Resources only stretch so far, young man. The truth is, women alone in this country face harsh choices. Had we reached Helena to find my son's circumstances changed, or worse, to find him not there at all?" She trailed off, her eyes drifting to Fiona, who was bent over her sewing with unusual concentration. "What would you have done?" Caleb asked, genuinely curious. It was Fiona who answered, her voice steady though she didn't look up from her work. "We discussed it before leaving Kentucky. If Uncle James couldn't take us in, I would seek a position as a schoolteacher or a companion to an elderly lady. And if that failed," she hesitated, "there are always men looking for wives, even women without dowries or prospects." The thought of Fiona marrying some stranger out of desperation sent an unexpected surge of jealousy through Caleb. "Surely it wouldn't come to that," he said, more harshly than he'd intended. Fiona finally looked up, her expression unreadable in the lamplight. "Women must be practical about such matters, Caleb. Sentiment is a luxury few can afford." "Isn't that what you accused me of?" he asked quietly, placing practicality above human connection. A faint blush colored Fiona's cheeks. "Perhaps we're not so different in that regard." Flora cleared her throat pointedly. "I believe I shall retire early tonight," she announced, gathering her sewing. "My old bones are protesting more than usual." After helping her grandmother to bed, Fiona returned to the main room to find Caleb still seated at the table, staring into the fire. She resumed her place across from him and picked up her sewing, a shirt of Caleb's that had torn at the elbow. "I've upset you," Caleb said after a long silence. "I didn't mean to." Fiona's needle flashed in and out of the fabric with practiced ease. You didn't upset me, you merely reminded me of realities I try not to dwell upon. She tied off a thread and bit it with her teeth before continuing. The future is uncertain for women without means or protection. I've accepted that my choices may be limited by circumstance rather than preference. And what would you prefer, Caleb asked, his voice low, if circumstance placed no limitations on your choices? The question hung in the air between them, weighted with implications neither was ready to address directly. Fiona set down her sewing and met his gaze steadily. I would prefer a life where I could contribute meaningfully, not just exist as an ornament or a burden. I would prefer a partnership based on mutual respect and affection, not mere convenience. She paused, then added softly, I would prefer to live somewhere beautiful, where the sky goes on forever and the mountains stand watch like ancient guardians. Somewhere like here, Caleb said, his mouth suddenly dry. Somewhere exactly like here, Fiona agreed, holding his gaze for a moment before returning to her sewing. The conversation marked a subtle shift in their relationship. Nothing was stated explicitly, but in the days that followed, Caleb found himself looking at his ranch with new eyes, not as the refuge of a solitary man, but as a potential home for a family. He began to make mental plans for expanding the cabin, adding a proper bedroom and perhaps a larger kitchen. He calculated how many more cattle he would need to support not just himself but a wife and, eventually, children. When he caught himself in these thoughts, Caleb would pull back sharply, reminding himself of the dangers of attachment. The winter would end. The Fosters would continue to Helena. His life would return to its solitary pattern. To imagine otherwise was to court devastating disappointment. Yet he couldn't help noticing how perfectly Fiona fit into his daily existence, how her presence transformed even the most mundane tasks into opportunities for connection. She learned to help with the livestock, insisting that she wanted to contribute more than just cooking and cleaning. Caleb found himself looking forward to their time in the barn, where conversation flowed more easily as they worked side by side. February arrived with a brief respite from winter's grip. The snow melted enough to create muddy paths between the buildings, and the sun shone with increasing warmth each day. Caleb used the opportunity to ride out and check on his cattle, which had been left to winter in a sheltered valley a few miles from the cabin. He returned one afternoon to find Fiona sitting on the porch step, face turned up to catch the weak sunlight. She wore a shawl over her dress but had left her head uncovered, and her chestnut hair gleamed with hints of copper and gold. "You'll catch cold," Caleb said as he dismounted. Fiona opened her eyes and smiled at him. "Worth it to feel the sun after so many gray days." She rose and came to help him with the horse. "How are the cattle?" "Better than expected," Caleb replied, impressed as always by her genuine interest in his work. "Lost only 3 over the winter so far, and the rest look healthy enough. The calves will start coming in another month or so." They worked together to unsaddle and brush down the horse, their movements having acquired a comfortable synchronicity over the weeks of shared tasks. As they finished, Fiona leaned against the stall door with a pensive expression. "Grandmother received a letter today," she said quietly. "A writer from town delivered it while you were gone." Caleb's heart sank. "From her son in Helena." Fiona nodded. "Uncle James writes that he has secured a position with a mining company and will be able to provide for us comfortably when we arrive." She twisted a strand of hair around her finger, a nervous habit Caleb had come to recognize. "He asks when we expect to reach Helena." "I see," Caleb said, focusing intently on hanging up the curry brush. "Well, that's good news, isn't it, that your uncle is established and waiting for you?" "Yes," Fiona agreed, though her tone lacked enthusiasm. "Grandmother is pleased, of course. She hasn't seen her son in nearly 15 years. They fell into silence, both avoiding the question that hung between them. When would the Fosters resume their journey? The wheel was repaired now, though Caleb had been deliberately slow with the final touches. The weather was improving daily. Soon there would be no practical reason for them to remain. "Will you miss it?" Caleb asked suddenly. "This place, I mean." Fiona's eyes met his, their green depths filled with an emotion he couldn't quite name. "Yes," she said simply, "more than I should, perhaps." Before Caleb could respond, Flora called from the cabin that supper was nearly ready. The moment passed, leaving Caleb with the uncomfortable sense that time was running out faster than he had anticipated. That night, he lay awake long after the house had grown quiet, turning over possibilities in his mind. He could ask Fiona to stay, to consider a future here with him. But what right did he have to separate her from her only remaining family? What could he offer that would compare to the security and opportunities of a growing city like Helena? His ranch was modest at best, still years away from the prosperity he had envisioned when he purchased the land. The cabin was small and rough, lacking the refinements that a woman like Fiona deserved. And he himself, a man who had deliberately avoided connections for most of his life, what kind of husband would he make? The thought brought him up short. Husband. The word had slipped into his consciousness without permission, carrying with it implications he wasn't sure he was ready to face. Yet as February gave way to March, Caleb found it increasingly difficult to imagine a future without Fiona in it. He watched her moving about the cabin, tending to her grandmother, working alongside him with the animals, and reading aloud in the evenings from one of the few books they possessed, a volume of Shakespeare's sonnets that Flora had carried all the way from Kentucky. In every domestic scene, Caleb saw not an intrusion into his solitary existence, but the completion of something he hadn't realized was incomplete. The decision, when it came, was both sudden and inevitable. On a clear March morning, with the first hints of spring evident in the green shoots pushing through the melting snow, Caleb rode into Willow Creek with a specific purpose in mind. He returned that evening with his purchase carefully wrapped and tucked into his coat pocket, determined to speak before his courage failed him. But as he approached the cabin, he saw a wagon in the yard, a visitor which was rare enough to give him pause. Tying his horse to the hitching post, Caleb entered the cabin to find Flora and Fiona seated at the table with a man he didn't recognize, tall and well-dressed, with a beard going gray at the edges and a prosperous air about him. "Ah, here he is now," Flora said, rising from her chair with more energy than Caleb had seen from her in weeks. "James, this is Caleb Morgan, the young man who saved our lives and has shown us such kindness." "Caleb, this is my son, James Foster." James stood and extended his hand. "Mr. Morgan, I can't thank you enough for what you've done for my mother and niece. When their letters stopped arriving in Helena, I feared the worst." Caleb shook the offered hand mechanically, his mind struggling to process the situation. "You came looking for them," he said, stating the obvious. "Indeed," James confirmed. "When I received no word after November, I began to inquire with travelers heading east. A merchant finally remembered meeting two women matching their description who had mentioned continuing to Helena. He recalled they had left just before the first blizzard. His expression grew grave. "I've been searching since January whenever weather permitted travel." "It's providential that you found us," Flora said, patting her son's arm affectionately. "We had just been discussing when we might resume our journey now that spring is coming." Caleb's eyes found Fiona's across the room. She sat very still, her hands folded in her lap, her face pale but composed. There was a question in her gaze that pierced him to his core. "When do you plan to leave?" he asked, addressing James but watching Fiona. "As soon as possible," James replied briskly. "I've secured a house in Helena, nothing grand but comfortable enough, and I must return to my duties with the mining company. We'll leave tomorrow if the weather holds." "Tomorrow," Caleb repeated, the word feeling like a physical blow. All his careful planning, his gradual working up of courage, rendered meaningless by this unexpected development. "That's very soon." "There's no reason to delay," James said, oblivious to the undercurrents in the room. "The trail to Helena is passable now, and my wagon is in good condition. We can transfer their belongings in the morning." Flora smiled brightly, though Caleb thought he detected a hint of concern as her gaze darted between him and Fiona. "It will be lovely to finally reach our destination after such a long journey," she said. "Though we shall miss this place and your company, Caleb." "And I yours," Caleb managed, his throat tight. Dinner that evening was a strained affair, at least for Caleb and Fiona. James dominated the conversation with tales of Helena's rapid growth and the opportunities available in the territory capital. Flora responded with enthusiasm, clearly delighted to be reunited with her son after so many years. Caleb spoke little and Fiona hardly at all, though she maintained a polite smile throughout the meal. James had brought a bottle of good whiskey, and after dinner he poured generous measures for himself and Caleb. "To new beginnings," he toasted, raising his glass, "and to the man who made them possible by safeguarding my family." Caleb drank mechanically, the whiskey doing little to ease the hollow feeling in his chest. When Flora declared herself tired and retired to the bedroom with James taking Caleb's usual place by the fire, Fiona slipped outside, wrapping her shawl around her shoulders against the evening chill. After a moment's hesitation, Caleb followed her. He found her standing at the edge of the porch, gazing out at the mountains silhouetted against the starlit sky. "Cold night," he said, for want of something better. "I've grown accustomed to Montana nights," Fiona replied without turning, "even the cold ones." Caleb moved to stand beside her, close enough to feel the warmth of her presence but not touching. "Your uncle seems like a good man." "He is," Fiona agreed, "very responsible, very certain about everything." There was something in her tone that made Caleb glance at her sharply. "You don't sound eager to reach Helena." Fiona turned to face him then, her expression difficult to read in the dim light spilling from the cabin windows. "What would you have me say, Caleb, that I've grown fond of this place? That the thought of leaving tomorrow makes me feel as though something precious is being taken from me before I've had the chance to fully claim it." Her words sent a surge of hope through Caleb, giving him the courage to ask the question that had been building in him for weeks. "What if you didn't have to leave?" Fiona's breath caught audibly. "What do you mean?" Caleb reached into his pocket and withdrew the small package he had carried back from town that day. With fingers that trembled slightly, he unwrapped it to reveal a simple gold ring. "I rode into Willow Creek today to buy this," he said quietly. "I had planned to ask you properly when the time was right. To tell you that these months with you have shown me how empty my life was before, how misguided I was to think that isolation was safer than connection." He took a deep breath. "I was going to ask if you might consider staying here, not as a guest but as my wife." Fiona's eyes widened, shining with unshed tears in the starlight. "Oh, Caleb," she whispered, "I know it's sudden," he continued quickly. "I know my ranch isn't much compared to the opportunities in Helena, but I believe it could be a good life, Fiona. We could build something meaningful here together." She reached out and touched his hand, the one holding the ring. "It isn't sudden at all," she said softly. "Not really. I think perhaps we've been moving toward this moment since the day you found us in the snow." Hope bloomed in Caleb's chest. "Then you'll consider it. Staying here with me." Fiona's expression clouded. "Grandmother has been dreaming of reuniting with Uncle James for years. I can't ask her to give that up, not when she's finally so close to achieving it." "She could visit," Caleb suggested, though he knew the solution wasn't that simple. "Or we could visit Helena when the ranch allows." "And what of Uncle James? He's come all this way to find us, has been searching since January." Fiona sighed, the sound heavy with conflicted emotions. "He's my only remaining family besides grandmother. How can I tell him I'm choosing to stay with a man I've known for barely 4 months?" Caleb felt the hope in his chest begin to fade. "So you're saying no?" "I'm saying I don't know how to reconcile what my heart wants with what my duty requires," Fiona corrected, her voice thick with emotion. "I'm saying that you have placed before me the most beautiful, impossible choice." Before Caleb could respond, the cabin door opened, spilling more light onto the porch. James stood in the doorway, his expression curious. "Everything all right out here? It's getting quite cold." "Fine, Uncle James," Fiona replied, stepping back from Caleb. "Just saying goodbye to the mountains." We were about to come inside. As they followed James back into the cabin, Caleb slipped the ring back into his pocket, the weight of it a reminder of dreams that seemed to be slipping away before they had fully formed. That night sleep eluded him entirely. He lay on a bedroll in the barn, having given up his usual place by the fire to James, listening to the soft sounds of the animals and trying to imagine how empty the ranch would feel once Fiona was gone. The possibility that had sustained him through the winter, that her presence might become permanent, now seemed like a cruel trick of hope. Dawn found him already at work, splitting wood with more force than necessary, as if physical exertion could somehow drive out the ache in his chest. He was stacking the split logs when James approached, already dressed for travel with his coat buttoned against the morning chill. "Morgan," he called, "might I have a word?" Caleb straightened, wiping his brow with his sleeve. "Of course, Mr. Foster." James came to stand beside him, examining the neatly stacked woodpile with an approving nod. "You've built something impressive here on your own." "That takes determination." "Thank you," Caleb replied, uncertain where the conversation was heading. "I noticed something last night," James continued, his tone conversational. "Something in the way my niece looked at you and you at her." He turned to face Caleb directly. "I'm not a sentimental man, Morgan. I believe in practical considerations above all else. But I also believe in recognizing the truth when it's staring me in the face." Caleb said nothing, waiting for the other man to continue. Do you love her? James asked bluntly. The directness of the question caught Caleb off guard, but he found he didn't need to search for the answer. Yes, he said simply, I do. James nodded as if confirming something to himself. And have you told her so? Not in those exact words, Caleb admitted, but I asked her to stay, to marry me. I see, James stroked his beard thoughtfully, and what did she say? That she couldn't leave your mother when she's been looking forward to reuniting with you. That she couldn't disappoint you after you've searched so long for them. A smile tugged at the corner of James's mouth, dutiful to a fault that girl always has been. He sighed, his breath forming a cloud in the cold morning air. When my brother died at Shiloh, I promised him I'd look after his family if anything happened to him. I've tried to honor that promise as best I could from a distance. Sent money when I could, letters when I couldn't. He paused, gazing out toward the mountains. But I'm not so arrogant as to believe I know what's best for Fiona now that she's a grown woman. Nor am I selfish enough to insist she sacrifice her happiness for my convenience. Caleb felt a surge of something like hope. What are you saying, Mr. Foster? I'm saying that if you love my niece and she loves you, then perhaps there's a solution that serves everyone's interests. James turned back to Caleb with a shrewd expression. How much would it cost to add a room or two to this cabin of yours? I've been saving to expand come spring, Caleb replied, hope growing stronger. I could add 2 rooms for about $300, including materials and hiring help for the heavier work. James nodded. And your herd, is it large enough to support a family? 65 head now with 20 calves expected this spring. It's enough to be comfortable though not wealthy, and I'm looking to expand. Good, good. James extracted a cigar from his coat pocket and lit it, puffing thoughtfully. Here's what I propose, Morgan. My mother is old, and while she's spry for her age, the journey to Helena nearly killed her once already. I won't risk it again, especially not when she seems to have found a place here that agrees with her. Caleb stared at him, hardly daring to believe what he was hearing. If you're willing to provide a home for both my niece and my mother, I'll contribute the funds to expand your cabin appropriately, James continued. I'll also invest in your ranch, say, enough to double your herd over the next year. In return, I ask only that you care for them both as they deserve, and that you allow me to visit when business permits. You're giving me your blessing? Caleb asked, wanting to be absolutely clear. James chuckled. I'm making a practical arrangement that benefits all parties. My mother gets the comfort and safety she needs in her remaining years. My niece gets the husband of her choosing and a future with prospects. I get the peace of mind of knowing they're both cared for, without the daily responsibility that would distract from my business ventures. He extended his hand. Do we have an agreement, Morgan? Caleb grasped the offered hand firmly. We do, Mr. Foster. And I promise you won't regret it. See that I don't, James replied, though his eyes were kind. Now, I suggest you go and inform the ladies of our arrangement before they finish packing. Caleb didn't need to be told twice. He strode toward the cabin with purpose, his heart lighter than it had been in hours. At the door, he paused to collect himself, then entered to find Fiona carefully wrapping her grandmother's few precious possessions in fabric for the journey. She looked up at his entrance, her green eyes shadowed with the same sadness he had felt all night. Good morning, Caleb. We'll be ready to leave within the hour. There's been a change of plans, he replied, unable to suppress a smile. Your uncle and I have come to an arrangement. Flora, who had been folding clothing nearby, looked up sharply. What sort of arrangement? Before Caleb could answer, James entered behind him. A sensible one, Mother, he said, crossing to kiss Flora's cheek. I've decided that you and Fiona will remain here with Mr. Morgan while I return to Helena alone. What? Fiona gasped, her hands stilling on the package she'd been wrapping. But Uncle James, you came all this way. And I found you safe and well cared for, James interrupted gently. More than that, I found you happy in a way I've not seen since before your father died. He glanced at Caleb. Mr. Morgan has asked for your hand, has he not? Fiona's cheeks flushed pink. He has, but I never thought. That I would approve, James finished for her. I'm not so old-fashioned as to believe that marriage should be based solely on practical considerations. And I'm not so selfish as to demand you leave a place and a person who clearly bring you joy. Flora clapped her hands together in delight. Oh, James, you always were a sensible boy. This is a perfect solution. "You're not disappointed?" Fiona asked her grandmother, relief and hope warring in her expression. "You've talked of nothing but seeing Uncle James again for so long." "And I have seen him," Flora replied, patting her son's hand affectionately. "But at my age, comfort and security mean more than adventure. This place suits me, child, and more importantly, it suits you." Her eyes twinkled as she glanced between Fiona and Caleb. "Besides, I've grown rather fond of watching young love unfold before my eyes." Fiona turned to Caleb, her eyes shining with unshed tears. "Is this real? Are we truly staying?" In answer, Caleb crossed the room in 3 strides and dropped to one knee before her, drawing the ring from his pocket once more. "Fiona Foster, I've lived most of my life believing that the frontier was no place for love, that survival required isolation. You've shown me how wrong I was." He took her hand in his, the ring held between them like a promise. "Will you stay here, not as a guest but as my wife? Will you help me turn this ranch into the home it was always meant to be?" "Yes," Fiona whispered, tears spilling freely now. "Yes, Caleb Morgan, I will stay and I will be your wife, and we will build something beautiful here together." As he slipped the ring onto her finger and rose to embrace her, Caleb felt the final pieces of his old belief system crumble away. The frontier wasn't a place where love couldn't survive, it was a place where love was essential, where the harshness of the land made human connections not weaker but stronger, not a luxury but a necessity. James and Flora discreetly moved to the porch, giving the newly engaged couple a moment of privacy. When Caleb finally released Fiona from his embrace, she looked up at him with an expression of such joy that it took his breath away. "I love you," he said, the words he had never spoken before coming easily now. "I think I've loved you since that first night, when you made stew from nearly nothing and treated this cabin like it was a home worth caring for." "And I love you," Fiona replied, her hands resting on his chest. "For finding us in the snow, for opening your home when you preferred solitude, for showing me that there are good men in this world who keep their word and their hearts open despite the hardships they've faced." Their first kiss was gentle, a meeting of souls as much as bodies, a promise of all the days to come. When they finally parted, Fiona's cheeks were flushed and Caleb felt a sense of rightness, of homecoming, unlike anything he had ever experienced. "Shall we join your family?" he asked, offering her his arm. "We have plans to discuss." "Yes," Fiona agreed, slipping her hand through his elbow. "We have a future to build." The wedding took place 2 weeks later, a simple ceremony performed by the circuit preacher who happened to be passing through Willow Creek. The entire settlement turned out for the occasion, curious to meet the woman who had captured the heart of the valley's most confirmed bachelor. James stayed for the wedding, then returned to Helena with promises to visit in the summer once the cabin expansion was complete. Before leaving, he presented the couple with a substantial wedding gift, a herd of 30 prime breeding cows and 2 bulls, delivered by cowboys he had hired for the task. "A stake in your future," he told Caleb as they shook hands in farewell. "I expect regular reports on the ranch's progress and on my mother's well-being." "You'll have them," Caleb promised, "and a place to stay whenever you visit." As spring bloomed across the Montana landscape, Caleb and Fiona fell into the rhythm of married life with a naturalness that surprised even them. The work was hard, building the additional rooms onto the cabin, tending to the enlarged herd, planting a larger garden to support the family. But they faced it together, finding joy in shared labor and quiet moments of connection. Flora took charge of the household, her health improving with the warmer weather and the contentment of seeing her granddaughter happily settled. She became a favorite with the neighboring settlers, who came to rely on her knowledge of herbal remedies and her wisdom in matters of heart and home. By summer's end, the cabin had doubled in size, with a proper bedroom for Caleb and Fiona, another for Flora, and an expanded kitchen that became the heart of the home. Caleb found himself hosting Sunday dinners for neighboring ranchers and their families, the isolation of his former life replaced by a community that grew stronger with each passing season. One evening in late August, as they sat on the porch watching the sunset paint the mountains in shades of gold and purple, Fiona took Caleb's hand and placed it gently on her abdomen. "I have news," she said softly, her eyes luminous in the fading light. Caleb's heart seemed to stop for a moment, then resume at double pace. "Are you certain?" Fiona nodded, a smile spreading across her face. Grandmother confirmed it. "The baby should arrive in early spring, around the time of our first anniversary." Joy unlike anything Caleb had ever known swept through him. He gathered Fiona into his arms, holding her as if she were the most precious thing in the world, which, to him, she was. "Thank you," he whispered against her hair, "for finding your way into my life, for staying when you could have gone, for giving me a family when I thought I would always be alone." Fiona leaned back to look up at him, her hand coming to rest against his cheek. "Thank you for sheltering us when we had nowhere else to go, for opening your home and then your heart, for showing me what it means to be truly cherished." As they kissed beneath the vast Montana sky, with the first stars beginning to appear above the mountains, Caleb reflected on the journey that had brought them to this moment. He had once believed that the frontier was no place for love, that survival required isolation and detachment. How wrong he had been. It was here, in the harsh beauty of the untamed West, that he had found not just survival but life in its fullest measure. It was here, with Fiona by his side and their child growing beneath her heart, that Caleb Morgan had discovered the truth. That love was not a weakness to be feared, but a strength to be embraced, not a luxury to be sacrificed, but a necessity to be cherished. And as the evening deepened into night, with Fiona's hand held securely in his, Caleb gave thanks for the blizzard that had brought her to his door, for the broken wheel that had given him time to learn to love, and for the courage they had both found to build a life together on the frontier that had once seemed too harsh for such tender failings. In the years that followed, the Morgan Ranch prospered, growing from a modest homestead to one of the most successful operations in the valley. Caleb and Fiona welcomed 3 children, 2 sons and a daughter, who grew up strong and capable under the Montana sky. Flora lived to see all 3 great-grandchildren born, passing peacefully in her sleep at the age of 82, surrounded by the family that had formed around her in the most unexpected of circumstances. And though life on the frontier never grew easy, there were droughts and harsh winters, cattle diseases and market fluctuations. Caleb and Fiona faced each challenge together, their love deepening with each passing year, their partnership proving that even in the wildest places, the human heart could find its home. Long after their hair had turned silver and their steps had slowed, visitors to the Morgan Ranch would remark on the palpable sense of love that filled the expanded homestead. And Caleb, watching Fiona rock their grandchildren on the same porch where he had once proposed, would smile at the memory of the lonely cowboy he had been and the extraordinary journey that had led him from isolation to belonging, from survival to joy. For in the end, it wasn't the land or the cattle or even the sturdy walls of the home they had built together that mattered most. It was the love that had begun in a blizzard, the connection that had transformed a shelter into a home, and the family that had grown from the most unexpected of meetings between a lonely cowboy and the woman who would become his forever love.